Some scholars posit the existence of a Thomasine community and a Johannine community within early Christianity. The followers of Thomas saw the resurrection as being more of an act of spiritual enlightenment, whereas the followers of John saw it as being more of a factual, bodily resurrection. This would explain why John's Gospel paints the Thomas character as being the infamous Doubting Thomas, which just goes to show there was much disagreement among early Christians on how to understand Jesus. In fact, even the most conservative Christian scholars will admit that it took hundreds of years before all the various so-called heresies were stamped out, and the more standard form of Christianity that we know today took hold. The fact that early on there was not a single Christianity, but rather many Christianities, is an important point that we will return to when we take a look at the Quran. A lot of people assume that when Muhammad showed up, there were people called Jews, there were people called Christians, and then because of him, there were now people called Muslims. Three nice, neatly divided groups. But this was not the case. For example, the Talmud, which would go on to become the authoritative text for rabbinical Judaism, was only recently completed. It was finished around the year 500 CE, just 70 years before the birth of Muhammad. So there was likely still quite a bit of diversity among Jews, especially in faraway places such as southern Arabia and Ethiopia. And the same was true of Christianity. As I mentioned in my video on the Gospels, there were initially many different Christianities, and it took many centuries before the dominant version stamped out all the other versions, which it considered to be heresies. Remember, although it started in the 1st century CE, Christianity didn't really take off until the 4th century CE, when it became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. It would thus have been around the 4th and 5th centuries, not too long before Muhammad, that the so-called heretical versions of Christianity might have shifted to places outside of Roman influence. Places like, Arabia. In other words, it's not hard to imagine that Muhammad would have come into contact with various different types of Christians and Jews, and that the types of Christians and Jews that he came into contact with were the ones that were outside of the mainstream. For example, there once existed a group called the Ebionites that fit somewhere in between Judaism and Christianity. On the one hand, they accepted Jesus as an important prophet and saw him as being the Messiah. But on the other hand, they rejected his divinity and continued to follow Jewish laws, such as not eating pork. Sounds a lot like Islam to me. As far as we know, the Ebionites had mostly disappeared by the time that Muhammad came onto the scene. However, there were likely still groups around that had been influenced by them, groups that then perhaps went on to influence Muhammad. When it comes to holy books, Judaism has the Tanakh, which is made up of the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Christianity also uses the Tanakh, but calls it the Old Testament. This is because Christianity has a second book, which it calls the New Testament. However, Mormonism takes things one step further. It uses both the Old and New Testaments and then adds to them a third book, known as the Book of Mormon, subtitled Another Testament of Jesus Christ. The introduction of an entirely new set of scriptures is one of the reasons why some academics consider Mormonism to be a completely separate religion and not just another branch of Christianity. So, in a similar manner to how Christianity started out as a branch of Judaism, but then eventually became its own religion, we might actually be witnessing a similar thing happening with Mormonism. In my video on the Quran, I talked about the fact that there were originally many different types of Christianities, but that one type eventually won out. The technical term for this quote-unquote winner is Nicene Christianity, which basically means churches that believe that Jesus was in fact God and that he shares one essence with God the Father and the Holy Spirit, a doctrine known as the Trinity. So even though there are many different branches of Christianity today, such as Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, etc., they all fall under the umbrella of Nicene Christianity. In contrast, Islam was likely influenced by one of the many non-Nicene types of Christianity that no longer exist. Probably one that saw Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, but not as God. In a similar manner, Mormonism is also based on one of the non-Nicene versions of Christianity. In this case, the type that sees Jesus as God, but as being distinct in essence from God the Father. So basically, from the Mormon point of view, they would say that Nicene Christianity took the wrong path, and that Mormonism represents the restoration of the correct, original path.